Good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us for the first of our webinars for 2024, but I think the fifth in our series of webinars that we started in the middle of 2023 last year. I'm so pleased to welcome you this evening for what I think promises to be a really informative and important evening on the topic of seeking the recommended treatments for OCD. I'm incredibly grateful to our two speakers this evening, who I'll introduce to you more fully in a moment or two. But Barbara and Paul, who are speaking to us this evening, are really integral members of our helpline team and our navigating services information team. And I think what they will say to us all this evening will be really insightful and inspiring, and we will all take something away that will help us in the coming weeks and months. Just a reminder, if this is the first webinar you've joined from OCD Action's webinar series, we, the panelists and everybody speaking this evening, can't see you. So do feel really free to be as comfortable as you as you feel you can be at home, and move around as you need to, so that there's no way that we can visibly see you. Just to give you a sense of how the webinar is going to move through this evening, they're a bit shorter than some of our other ones. So we'll be about 90 minutes this evening. And we're going to start with a presentation from Barbara. She will talk through some of the learning that she's had from volunteering and working with OCD Action over the last few years, and some of the key information that she thinks you need to know in terms of seeking treatment. And then there will be a short break of about 10 minutes, and then we're going to address some of the really key questions that have come up. And again, just a slightly different format from some of the webinars that we've done recently. We're not going to be taking questions this evening, so we're not going to be taking live questions. We actually asked for questions to be submitted in advance, and we're going to spend about 20-25 minutes running through the questions that came up most often. So because we thought there would be so many questions that maybe came up, and maybe some very specific questions, we wanted to make sure that in the time we had, we covered the most important, the questions that came up most frequently this evening. And we also wanted to make sure that Paul and Barbara had a bit of time to prepare for answering those questions. If at the end of this evening there are more questions that you have, you're really welcome to contact our helpline, which they can be contacted by email or phone, and I'm sure somebody will put in the chat now the details for that, and the details for contacting the helpline will be shared again at the end of Barbara's presentation, I know. So there will be lots of opportunities to access those details, and they're on our website. We really hope everything runs smoothly this evening, but if there are any tech issues, there's an email address that I know somebody's going to pop in the chat that you can contact, and hopefully we will be able to sort those out. The session is being recorded this evening, so if you need to step away at any point, there will be other opportunities to access the information. Also, we are sharing quite a lot of information this evening. We know we are. So if you miss any of it or want to revisit it, we will be putting the information on our website, the recording, within the next kind of week, 2 weeks. So don't feel that if you miss anything on first hearing, that's your last opportunity. And keeping in mind the fact that we are recording the information this evening, or recording the session this evening, we would really encourage you to take care of yourself. So if you need to step away at any point just to take a break, or you feel that it would be better for you and your well-being to come back to it at another point, we'd really encourage you to do that. And equally, if you do feel you need any additional support, again, in the chat, there is links to organisations that can provide you immediate support this evening. And again, of course, our services, if you need any support. So just before I get started, I move away from this evening, and Barbara starts her presentation, I just wanted to briefly introduce Barbara and Paul, and perhaps they could put their cameras on so you can see who will be joining us this evening to speak. So just briefly to introduce Barbara, who will be running through the information slides shortly for us. Barbara is a really dedicated mental health advocate and has a really extensive background in workplace mental health, research particularly, and is also a co-founder of a global corporate mental health work programme. Barbara has personal experience of OCD as a parent of a child with OCD, and I think this really spurred her on to start volunteering with OCD Action. And she joined OCD Action, which we were very pleased about, in 2021 as a helpline volunteer. And since then, she's also gone on to start leading some of our interactive navigating services groups. So Barbara has a huge wealth of knowledge about the things that we all need to know about seeking treatment for OCD. And Barbara is a really strong and a really inspiring verbal communicator. So when she comes to speak to us in a moment, you really will be in for a really powerful evening. And then Paul, who is also a helpline volunteer and a really valued member of our team at OCD Action, has been a volunteer with us since 2019. And I think he also was inspired to join us because of his own lived experience of OCD. Paul is also a very skilled businessman and runs his own commercial property company. He's also a really, really skilled communicator. I've read a lot of his written work, and he's published as a freelance writer in a number of journals and newspapers. So again, when he joins us for the panel and to take questions later, he really is somebody to hear from and to take a lot from in terms of his experience. So Paul is going to step away for a couple of moments while Barbara talks us through the presentation. I know they can't hear us, but because I think we're in for such a treat, I would really encourage you to give Barbara a warm round of applause. Barbara, welcome, and we look forward to hearing from you.
Well, thank you so much, Lee, and thank you for your very kind words. It's a wonderful organisation to be part of and a privilege to work with OCD Action and to be here this evening to talk to all of you. OCD is a recognised medical condition. It affects around 1 to 2% of the population. It can start at almost any age. For some, they may be as young as 6 years old. It may start in your teens. It may not start until you're a fully grown adult. It just seems to be one of those things that happens at any time in your life. This wonderful graphic done by Laura, who does the OCD doodles, is a brilliant way, I think, of representing what OCD is and how it works. It starts, if you like, at the top of that diagram with a thought. The thought's uninvited, can often come absolutely out of the blue. It can be an image, something that just comes into your mind as an image. It can be a thought or a recollection, an idea, feeling, a sensation. It's often quite different for different people. Some people, OCD or thoughts will always focus on the same topic. For others, it may shift regularly or from time to time. What that thought is often very stressful. It brings with it enormous distress. I would actually put that word in bold if I was drawing this diagram myself. Feelings of fear, disgust, horror, embarrassment, terror, just such a trauma that these thoughts come into your mind and you have to deal with them. And then it leads to something we call the compulsion. It's a sense of having to do something or sometimes not do something in order to avoid whatever it is that you think may happen as a result of those intrusive thoughts. Again, they can really vary from person to person. They might be a very physical thing, something you might see in the outside world, tapping, counting, checking. It may be something in your head that nobody else would see. invisible to the rest of the world, but in your mind, you're going over and over some kind of mental ritual or just ruminating on what is happening in your head over and over again. For many people, it involves seeking reassurance, asking if it's normal, checking whether anyone else has noticed it. And often it also means avoidance, not going somewhere where you might encounter something that might trigger that intrusive thought, or that might be a place where you might have to or feel you had to do your compulsion. And then the final stage of the kind of cycle is relief. And I would put this into teeny tiny writing. I'd put the distress into huge writing and the teeny tiny relief, because the relief comes as a result of doing the compulsion, but often it's momentary and almost just a few seconds, minutes after carrying out whatever that compulsion is, that intrusive thought starts to come into your head and starts nagging you again. And then the cycle starts to repeat itself. And that is the difficulty of the OCD cycle. Now, if we move on to, as I mentioned at the very, very beginning in my first comment, OCD is a recognized condition, and so too is the treatment for OCD. The treatment for OCD is recognized in guidelines that are set out by the National Institute for Clinical Excellence, or you sometimes hear them referred to as the NICE guidelines. And I don't know if you'd mind, wonderful, thank you. These guidelines for you as an individual are a source of phenomenal power. They are brilliant for anyone who is seeking treatment or anyone who's finding it hard to get the medical profession to listen to them. They apply to OCD and they also apply to BDD, and they can be used to help in the treatment of body-focused repetitive disorders, although they're not specifically written about that condition. The recommendations are based on thorough research, and they set out two, and I stress the only two, proven effective treatments for OCD and BDD. And those two are CBT, cognitive behavioural therapy, with exposure and response prevention. Long words, we'll come back to them, don't worry. And certain anti-obsessional medication. Any other treatments that they explored in writing the NICE guidelines, there was no evidence to prove that they were successful. And that's really, really important thing to bear in mind. Two proven effective treatments. The same treatments are used to treat BFRB, which is body-focused repetitive behaviours, but there aren't any actual NICE guidelines for those. But the guidelines can still be used in sort of informing treatment. The guidelines themselves aren't legally binding, but they are very often cited in case law. So in effect, it is what the expected treatment is. I'm going to come on to the details of the two different types of treatments in a few minutes. But first, I want to talk a little bit about how you can use the guidelines and where you can find them. I think the guidelines have two really, really important uses. The first one is in helping you understand what good treatment looks like, so you can be sure that you or whoever you're advocating for or helping knows what gets that right treatment. And secondly, they can help you discuss or indeed argue in a situation where you might have to fight for your treatment or appeal against the decision. They can really help you argue from the basis of power using these NICE guidelines. The medical professional are very familiar with them, and therefore you can kind of use them as a tool or a weapon. There are 4 different versions of the guidelines, and each one has a slightly different purpose. The first one written for the public. They're written in slightly more simple non-medical language, so they're really great for anyone who just wants to quickly get to grips with what the NICE guidelines are all about. And again, we're talking about what OCD looks like, what the treatment is for it, and how to access that treatment. And then there are the quick reference guidelines, and I'm going to show you a chart from this a little bit later, and I'll point it out. It's one of my favorite documents. And then you have the 2 longer documents, the guidelines and the full guidelines, where you have all of the details. Those can be invaluable. not only if you want to just really get your head around everything to do with the effective treatment of OCD, but if you've got a very specific situation, for example, where somebody has two conditions, where they might have OCD alongside something like autism, or where your treatment process isn't working very well and you're having to think about what happens next. So they can give you that extra detail and that extra bit of power. So I'm going to talk now about those recommended treatments, the two different types of treatment that we have. And the first one being cognitive behavioural therapy with exposure and response prevention, shortly known as CBT with ERP. CBT is a type of talking therapy. And if you like, the cognitive bit is around how you change the way you think, and the behavioural bit is how you change the way you behave. So that's sort of looking at the sort of embedded patterns that you have in the way you think and the way you behave as a result of that thinking. Exposure is about choosing to expose yourself to the things that are triggering, that are starting that whole cycle. So those thoughts that are coming into your mind, those things that you most fear. And then the response prevention piece is about learning to sit with the feelings of anxiety, trauma, guilt, shame, doubt that come into your mind along with those thoughts. And I'm going to ask if we can maybe just move slides now, because I think it's really helpful to look at this particular chart. One of the reasons why you have to take ERP a little bit gently, it's because it can be uncomfortable at first. What it's asking you to do is to face those fears and to sit with them. And it can be quite hard when you start thinking about treatment to imagine how this will work. You quite often fear that if you sit with those and don't carry out the compulsion, that anxiety, that stress is just going to escalate and escalate out of control. It's very common to think that. The reality is actually what happens is after a while, the mind almost gets tired of sending out all that stress and it kind of starts to relax a little bit. And the more the exposure happens, the more you do those exposures, the less that anxiety peaks, and then it begins to sort of subside a little bit more quickly till over time, the power that those thoughts have decreases and decreases and decreases. And they stop having that absolute rule over your life that they can have when you're in the midst of a difficult period of OCD. Because it's quite hard, treatment has to be taken step by step. You need to have a therapist that you trust and that you can build a good relationship with. And they don't begin with the biggest, most awful worry or thought that you have. They should be starting with something a little bit further down, you and they together agreeing how you're going to go about this and doing it very gently. It's really important that you build your understanding of how this works, that you can see what's happening to your mind when the stress builds, and that you have that trust and that confidence in the process so that you can then begin to apply it to the more serious and perhaps more scary thoughts that you have. So it's gentle, baby steps in partnership with your therapist. That's how it should be done. Now, if you're seeking treatment and you think you or your child, your partner isn't getting this kind of exposure treatment, it's really important at that moment that you stop and ask why not, and to find out why. And if you're struggling, please don't hesitate to come to the helpline and have a chat with us. Often on the helpline, when we find people who say it didn't work, the treatment didn't work, what was actually going on was that they weren't getting effective exposure and response prevention treatment. Perhaps they were getting straightforward CBT, which can sometimes be helpful, can take some of the stress away, but it is not going to make your OCD better. It's got to have that ERP in it. On the next slide, we talk a little bit about how it adapts, how ERP is adapted for the different disorders. It's still used within the body dysmorphic disorder, but in BDD, it's changed a little bit to talk about something called attention refocusing. And that allows people to learn how to refocus their attention away from their appearance and start engaging with other activities that allow them to get on with their life, improve their mood, and so on. And then for the BFRBs, the body focused repetitive behaviors, again, it's adapted to include habit reversal. So it's the same kind of technique, but it must be adapted to fit that particular condition. And indeed, it should always be adapted to suit you as an individual. So the first part of the treatment, the first of those effective treatments is the CBT with ERP, and the second is anti-obsessional medication. Again, lots of people who come to the helpline and people that I've talked to, at home, they are a bit nervous about the idea of taking medication. Medication for mental health sometimes comes with some pretty heavy labels and sort of thoughts attached to it. And indeed, you should never, ever be pressurized into taking medication that you don't want to need. But that said, it can make a proven difference for many, many people. If you're over 18, initially you should be offered one of 6 SSRIs. These are selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. I always think when I talk about OCD, it's full of horrendous acronyms. So SSRIs, there are 6 that you can choose from. If one doesn't work, if the first one you try doesn't work for you, if you find it's got too many side effects, there's 5 more that you can try. Don't give up. Sometimes people will find the first one works brilliantly. Sometimes it takes 2 or 3 for them to get the one that really, really works for them. And if for any reason that doesn't work, there's clomipramine, which you can also try. And beyond that, there are other options. So, my view is always, there's always something more. Never give up. For children, for those that are 18 or below, it is recommended in the NICE guidelines that treatment begins with talking therapy. So it should not, in an ideal world, ever begin with medication. Though medication may be effective for somebody under the age of 18, but must always be something that you discuss very carefully with the medical professionals. And there are only 2 of those SSRIs that are recommended for children and young people under the age of 18. I'm going to go on now to talk about how do you get the treatment. So navigating those treatments to find out, how do you get on board? You know what a treatment should be. So how do you get that treatment? And I'm going to start this by talking about how the NHS kind of works, how mental health services are structured, because I think to navigate the treatment options, it's really, really helpful to understand what the kind of whole picture looks like. So the NHS offers treatment for OCD in steps or tiers for children, steps for adults. Each step brings with it more treatment options, always centered around this ERP and the different medications that are available. But as it steps up, there tend to be more treatment options and more intensity in the treatment and a more specialist team delivering that treatment. For adults, the different steps are offered by different teams within the NHS, primary care, secondary care, and then tertiary and specialist care. For children or those under 18, it's always offered within CAMS. You sometimes see CAMS called with the acronym CYPMHS these days, Children and Young People's Mental Health Services. But mostly I've seen CAMS still used, but you might see that. I love this chart. I love this chart. It comes from that quick reference version of the NICE guidelines. And I love it because it, in one simple page, it gives you a way of discussing what your treatment should look like and which step or tier it should begin at. And that can be incredibly important. And I'll explain that by giving just a couple of examples. For most people, the right place to begin treatment will be in what we would call primary care. So the GP is that kind of recognition, that entry level point towards the bottom of those steps. and then the GP refers you on into primary care, and you would go up the steps if necessary, and I'll explain what I mean by that in a moment. But for some people, it's better that they start further up, that they start within secondary care or even at times within specialist care. For example, if somebody has two conditions, if they have OCD alongside autism or post-traumatic stress disorder, it might be the right thing not to start in primary care, but to start at step 4 in secondary care as an adult, or tiers 2 and 3 within CAMS. If you've been through a couple of the steps already, then going back to the beginning may not be the right thing for you. If you're starting treatment again after some time, you may need to go back in at a higher step. What I love about this chart is it gives you the chance to look at it and say, look, I'm reading all of this stuff, and you can read it in the context of the wider NICE guidelines as well. I think where I need to be treated, or where my son or daughter needs to be treated, is in step 4. And you can go in and begin that conversation with the medical professional, sort of with you leading the conversation, not just waiting for them to tell you what they might do. So it can really help you come across as knowledgeable, with information. And again, it's referring to those NICE guidelines, the medical guidelines, the clinical guidelines that the NHS is expected to use. So they can be incredibly powerful. So if you take something with you to the GP, if you take something with you in to see the mental health team, this can often be a brilliant, brilliant place to start. So where do you go? Okay, how do you start accessing that steps ladder? Well, the first step that most people take is to go to their GP. And the GP should always treat you with respect and understanding. They don't always have the best knowledge about OCD. And there are some links in our website, and they're listed at the bottom of this slide, that can give you some things that you can take with you to help your GP, maybe bring them back up to speed for something they maybe haven't studied for a while, and help them understand what OCD is. A GP does not need to know about the nature of the thoughts that someone is having. All they really need to understand is that you're experiencing that cycle. And again, it's that loop. You don't have to explain what the thoughts are, but you can say, look, I know that I'm experiencing this OCD cycle that we set out in that very, very first slide. The GP can then send you on into the right place in that chart. So one of the useful things to bring with you to that GP discussion is that chart, so that they then refer you into the NHS mental health services at the right level. So let's talk a little bit more about those steps and where the GP can refer you to. So for adults, the first place that most adults will be referred to is called primary care. And primary care is for the treatment of adults who have mild to moderate symptoms or first time accessing the treatment. In England, you may see this referred to as IAPT, which stands for Improving Access to Psychological Therapies, or more recently, we keep seeing it being called talking therapies. So you might just see it simple talking therapies. There are 2 levels within that primary service. So there's low intensity, and then there's high intensity. And I guess the most important thing is, when they're referring you in, is to really be clear that you must be accessing the treatment that is CBT with ERP. If it doesn't have that, it's not going to treat your OCD effectively. If you live in England, there is a way of self-referring to IAPT services without going through your GP. You can Google a link, and if you just Google IAPT, it will come, or even Google Talking Therapies, it will come up with a link, and you can make a self-referral. That can be useful if for some reason you and your GP have fallen out and they're really being unhelpful, or maybe you're struggling to get another GP at some point. So it can be a very useful way of going in. What it doesn't do is give you the opportunity of having that discussion, and that discussion about at what level should you be treated at. The other place that you can be referred to is immediately into secondary care, which is called the Community Mental Health Team. And you can be referred into there if your first treatment wasn't successful, You should be referred there if you've got more than one condition or diagnosis, or if your symptoms are really severe and they're really impacting your everyday life. For children under 18, the referral would be straight into CAMHS. CAMHS, there's only one organisation that looks after those under the age of 18. So I want to talk a little bit about specialist treatment. So specialist treatment is there if those first treatments, if those first steps don't work. I think sometimes people feel if they've been through those first steps that, there's nowhere else to go. You've had the treatment, it's still not working, there's nowhere else to go. As I said earlier on, there's always somewhere else to go. And one of those is specialist treatment. That's where you're treated by the top specialists within the UK. To access specialist treatment, you do have to apply for funding. Now, this can feel a bit daunting. Don't worry about it. This would be a great thing to contact the helpline about if you're feeling a bit daunted about how to access tertiary care and how to apply for the funding or which funding might be best for you. We're very experienced at answering those questions on the helpline. So please don't struggle. Come and have a chat with us and talk about how the funding will work. There are a number of specialist treatment centres within the UK. They're listed on this slide here. There's CARAT, which is at the Maudsley Hospital in London. There's a specialised service in Hertfordshire. There's ADRU, which is at the Royal Bethlehem Hospital, also in London, or Kent, in fact. There's the National OCD and BDD service at the Springfield Hospital in London. There's the Oxford Centre, sometimes called OSPIC, and then there's the Advanced Intervention Service, which is in Scotland, in Dundee. That's the only one in Scotland, and there isn't one in Northern Ireland, and there isn't one in Wales. So you would be accessing, if you're living in Scotland or Northern Ireland or Wales, you would be accessing, not Scotland, you would be accessing one of these treatment providers here. Again, there's lots more information about this on our websites, or indeed give us a call. Now, so far, we talked about the kind of, I guess you'd call it the standard pathways. Go to the GP, GP refers you in typically at the bottom step, and then you make your way up the steps if you need to, as far as specialist care, should that be necessary. But there is one other very interesting route into care if you live in England. Unfortunately, it only applies in England, and that is called patient choice. To use patient choice, you mustn't be currently receiving treatment locally from the NHS, and you mustn't be on a wait list for treatment locally on the NHS. So if you were receiving treatment locally on the NHS, perhaps you were going to your local community mental health team, you would have to be discharged from that back to your GP in order to then begin to make an application through patient choice. Patient choice can be done by your GP, and there's really three different ways of accessing it. You can access it to go and see another mental health team. Now, why would you do this? You might do this because your own waiting list is very long and perhaps a nearby mental health team has a shorter waiting list, or it may be that the local authority that's closest to you, perhaps it's a different one, has a more specialised OCD team than the local authority team that you're with at the moment. So you might do it for one of those reasons. Secondly, you might do it to allow yourself access to one of the more specialist centres. So this gets a bit complicated. So if you get lost, don't worry, just give us a call and we'll explain it in more detail. But there are two treatment centres which were listed on that previous slide, which talked about specialist care. One is CARAT and one is the Oxford Centre, or OSPIC. So your GP and you may think that they're just specialist centres, and indeed they do offer specialist services, but they also offer access to their non-specialist services to anyone living within England via patient choice. So that means with just your GP to help you, and it's a pretty simple form that they have to fill in, you can make an application to one of these specialist centres and secure treatment there below the specialist level, but still within these specialist centres. It can be a tremendous option for people. And it's definitely worth having a look at. And again, if you want to chat more about it, come and give us a call. So that's how you access treatment. What happens when you get there? What happens when you've been to your GP or you've done your patient choice referral and there you are, you're meeting the mental health team for the first time? Well, regardless of what level you go in at, regardless of which way you've gone in, the first thing that will happen is an assessment. And that assessment is really important for you. So although it can be incredibly daunting to be open about what can be, well, frankly, scary, embarrassing thoughts that you're ashamed of, thoughts that you maybe fear you don't want anyone else ever to know, it's really important in this opening assessment that you can be as honest as you possibly can. Sometimes we're stiff upper lip mentality. You ask, are you okay? Yes, I'm fine. This is not the place for stoicism. It's the place to be very honest about how you're feeling, about what OCD is making you feel, about what it is stopping you from doing, about how it is impacting your life. And it's important because they're going to use that assessment in order to recommend treatment and to guide you into the right place for treatment within your NHS. So they'll make sure that your assessment is leading you to the right form of treatment. They may ask you to complete a questionnaire that will help them assess the severity of your OCD, as well as asking you some of those questions. After the assessment, once it's over, you should be told what happens next. That should be a referral into the right level of treatment within the NHS, and it must be treatment that includes CBT with ERP. If what you get back from the assessment is a bit vague, so it talks about an appointment or it talks about seeing a therapist, absolutely within your rights to go back and say, what do you mean? Can you tell me in more detail? Is this specifically going to include ERP? Again, really want to make sure if you're going to embark on treatment, if you're going to put all that time, all that energy, all that effort into treatment, that right from the word go, you're going to secure CBT with ERP. I want a quick word on waiting times. Waiting times for treatment vary, but they can be quite long in some areas, particularly at the moment. There are guidelines on waiting times for England and for Wales, and there is also some information available on Scotland too. Again, if you're having trouble with the waiting times, if you're given very long estimates for waiting, or you've been waiting for maybe a year already, please come back and talk to us, and we can give you some guidance on how to push back when waiting times are very, very long. I also want to talk a little bit about private options and private therapy. Private therapy can be pricey, but for some people it's what they would like to do. We don't actually recommend private therapists, but we do have lots of information on how you can go about looking for a private therapist. Perhaps the most important place to start is making sure that the therapist that you use is qualified for offering cognitive behavioural therapy. And you can do that by looking at the BAPCP directory. So if they are registered with the BAPCP, and that's the British Association for Behavioural and Cognitive Psychotherapies, you should be able to check and make sure that they are registered. Not everybody ends up on this actual directory, so you won't necessarily find every single qualified CBT therapist that there is in that directory. So it can sometimes help, as well as looking at the directory, to search using Google and just put in the keywords like BAPCP or OCD or BDD, and then search online for those different therapists. You can also check out the sites offered by some of the private medical companies. They will also sometimes be a way of discovering whether or not there is a local private therapist near you. If you are looking for a private psychiatrist, then the process is just a little bit different. And it's worth pointing out that You don't need a psychiatrist is the only person who can actually give you a diagnosis for OCD, and you don't need a diagnosis in order to get treatment. But some people need a diagnosis for a particular reason that they have of their own, or they simply want to speak to a private a psychiatrist in order to speak to someone with that level of experience and that level of understanding about the condition, its treatment, and particularly the medication. If you do want to find a private therapist, then the best way to go is to the NHS's page of psychiatry. If you want to get more information about the psychiatrist itself, sometimes it's actually easier just to Google things like OCD or psychiatrist or Royal College of Psychiatrists, and that will bring you up a bit more information that is available on that NHS page. It's very bare, it doesn't give you very much detail about the psychiatrist. But remember, while it might be very helpful, while you might find it useful, it's absolutely not necessary for you to secure treatment. The assessment that is given when you're referred into the NHS services is more than enough to secure your treatment. But it can be useful, as I say, if you get stuck or if but you want to do it. Reasonable adjustments. So I'm going to move on away now from seeking treatment to talk about how you manage a little bit your life when you have OCD. And I'm going to do that by talking about what we call reasonable adjustments. So under UK legislation, OCD is considered to be a disability if you have a substantial and long-term, and by long-term it means lasting 12 months or more, effect on your ability to carry out normal day-to-day activities. And for many people with severe OCD, that absolutely does apply. And if you do have a disability, it gives you lots of rights, and some of those rights are to what we would call reasonable adjustments. Reasonable adjustments can be relevant in your employment. It can be relevant when you're seeking healthcare. It can be relevant for students at university, and it can be relevant for schools or in securing housing. And all a reasonable adjustment is something which allows you to make a slight change to your day-to-day, the way you'd be treated, to accommodate the fact that you have a disability. So for example, for somebody at school, it might be extra time taking exams, it might be a quieter space in which to sit the exam. It might be flexibility around attending school. It might be having particular technology aids that make your day-to-day work a little bit easier. In the workplace, it might be around hours of work, it might be around where your work is done from, around having the right to have time off for treatment, for rehabilitation, and so on. There's a fabulous and very comprehensive list of examples of reasonable adjustment on the Disability Rights UK. So that's worth having a look at. So don't let OCD hold you back. There are things that can help you manage your day-to-day life, manage your work, manage school, manage university, and still manage your OCD. And that really brings me to the end of the kind of formal presentation here today. And this slide gives you some information about our services. And I know just sitting here and hearing myself talk, it sounds complicated sometimes. All the acronyms, all the names, the different steps, the different medications, the different types and levels of treatment. If you want to talk one-on-one, then through the helpline, we've got amazing volunteers who will take the time to walk through your own situation, look at where you are particularly, and make sure that the information that you get is directly relevant to your own situation. And so, and again, we're always willing to follow up that call by putting something into an email so that you have it in writing as well. And at this point, I think I will thank you for your attention and hand you back to Lee.
Thank you so much, Barbara. That was such important information. And I think from whether it was understanding the power of the NICE guidelines or the importance of understanding ERP or even the information about patient choice, I think there will be something in there that everybody will take away from today. We're going to take a short break now, so just 10 minutes. We'll come back together at 5 to 8, and then give Barbara a chance to have a brief rest of her voice and a drink of water. And then Barbara and Paul are both going to come and answer a good number of questions, many of which will enable us to delve a little bit more into the information that Barbara has just shared, and some will explore some slightly new topics. So we really look forward to seeing you again in 10 minutes. Thank you, everybody. Welcome back, everybody. I hope you all had a good break and managed to perhaps get a drink. Perhaps if Paul and Barbara would be happy to join me now. Perhaps we'll just give Paul and Barbara a brief round of applause, even though they can't hear us, because they're joining us now back for our Q&A. So we have a really good cluster of questions, and I'm really pleased to see so many of you have stayed and are here for our Q&A session. So I think if everybody's happy, I'll just jump straight into the questions. And I think we've probably got 20-25 minutes or so to just run through the questions. So our first question, the person that has asked it has said that they're thinking of going to their GP for support, and they're wondering how you both might prepare for that. Paul, am I right that you've written a little bit on this? Would you be happy to start with that? And then Barbara, maybe you'd follow up a little bit if from your presentation.
Very happy to start. Can you hear me okay?
We can, yeah.
Okay. I just want to say, before answering that question, I want to say thank you to Barbara, because I feel like we've just had a PhD in OCD and the treatment. And
agreed.
I mean, I haven't made any secret. I've had OCD all my life. When I was growing up, I had no idea there was treatment for it. There's therapy, there's medication. There's an army of doctors, and there's us and all other people that can help. I just thought I had this sort of, strange, quirky need to do compulsions to do with my intrusive thoughts. So I wish I'd heard that speech that Barbara gave 30 years ago. But I do want to say to anyone that is listening tonight, you should be very proud of yourself for getting the knowledge with how to deal with OCD, because there are, in this country alone, there's probably over 700,000 people who have it. We wish everyone would listen to all of this information, everything Barbara had said, and seek out the treatment if they're ready. And, you should be proud of yourself for, if you're only at the starting line, for getting there. And if you're approaching the finishing line, that's great as well. But this is the most important thing, finding out how to, tackle this condition. In terms of how to prepare for a GP appointment, well, the first thing I would say is you're very welcome to call us. We can give you a lot of information about the recommended treatments. CBT with ERP is the main form of therapy that's recommended, and SSRIs are the main medications. There is an alternative to an SSRI if you don't react well to them. You can find the medication fact sheet on our website. We also provide a GP card, which we're very happy to send you. You can show it to your GP. The GP can read it, or show the GP what OCD is and what the registered treatments are. If you feel that your GP is really hopeless, you can change GP. That is your right. Don't stick with a GP out of loyalty if they're not going to do what's required. It's also worth knowing why someone would feel anxious about speaking to their GP. As Barbara said in her speech, you don't need to say to the GP what your intrusive thoughts are or what the compulsions are. If you have intrusive thoughts which make you do compulsive behavior, you can say that. The GP's main obligation and duty is just to refer you on, either to an IAP service if your symptoms are mild, or to your community mental health team if they're more severe, or they can refer you to the community mental health team, which can send you on to tertiary care. And I think, as Barbara mentioned, there are 2 tertiary care centres where you can apply through patient choice. The GP can make that referral. But the GP is not actually going to be doing the treatment. So the GP is really sort of a conduit to get to the treatment. I'm trying to think if there's anything else. And I suppose, going into it prepared is the main thing. There's a lot of information on our website you can read just to sort of brush up on what it is you're expecting. And then hopefully you'll feel a bit more prepared going into that meeting.
Brilliant. That's so helpful, especially thinking about the GP card and preparing well. Is there anything, Barbara, you wanted to add or build on from what Paul said?
I would agree with everything that Paul said, and I would just say it's information is power. I think going in well informed about the treatments and about what you want. GPs are very busy these days, so if you go in with a clear view of what you need and what you want, and tell them, sometimes that can really help.
Yeah, I think that's really important. And just to build on Paul, one of the things that you said, and I'm sure you'll both have thoughts on this, is you said if the GP kind of isn't responding to what you're asking for, you can change GPs. And actually, one of the people that gave us came in with a question said, my GP really isn't understanding OCD or isn't referring me, and what would you do? So presumably change might be one of the things you would suggest in that. Is there anything else or anything additional you might suggest in that situation?
Yeah, so there's a few things. One is that you can give up with that GP, change to another one. You can self-refer yourself to an IAP service if you live in England, and if you feel that's the best centre for you. IAP services are, as was mentioned, traditionally people with more mild symptoms, community mental health teams, people with more severe symptoms. But if you want to go to an IAP service, you can make that referral yourself. If you really feel you are struggling with the NHS, you can speak to an advocacy group like Mind or Power, which is POHWER. They can help you with accessing treatment. You can speak to your MP if you feel that they should be involved as casework. It might be worth reminding the GP that if you have OCD, you're entitled to treatment on the NHS. You are entitled to CBT with ERP. It's possible the GP isn't aware of that, and if they're not, they should be. And you can, of course, call us as well. We're very happy to give advice. I suppose there's always going to be a question mark on why the GP isn't making the referral. But the fact is, if you have OCD, you are entitled to be treated somewhere in the NHS, so they should be making a referral.
Yeah, I think that's really important, and really maybe arming the GP with a lot of the information, I think sounds so important. Barbara, is there anything that you wanted to add or build on there?
Not at all. I think I've covered everything.
Brilliant, thank you. And you mentioned there about self-referring to talking therapies. One of our questions came in from somebody who'd already had talking therapies, but their GP was asking them to self-refer again, and that in effect they felt that hadn't worked. So where would they go now? Barbara, I know you covered this quite a lot in terms of the stepped care model and that flow chart. Is that maybe something you to a bit in terms of the next steps after talking therapy?
So what you're describing is quite common, unfortunately, where people are sort of, back in at the bottom again. I think if you've already had therapy, the NICE guidelines are very clear. If you've had a round of therapy and that therapy has not made your OCD better and you're still experiencing the symptoms, then these NICE guidelines say basically, well, step you up. So go up to the next level. So that would probably be, in the case you're describing, Lee, that would probably be into the secondary tiered services at the local community mental health team. So yeah, it's really about making sure that you're very clear that that's what the NICE guidelines recommend, that you go up, not just back to the beginning again.
Perfect. And that's where people might be able to use that flow chart that you said, or the chart that people said that you showed that you enjoy and think is so powerful, because it describes that so clearly. Perfect.
Absolutely.
Thank you. Paul, is there anything you wanted to add or build on there?
Yeah, I need to say it might be the GP is suggesting that with the best of intentions, thinking that is the best place for you. You're very entitled to say to the GP, thank you for that recommendation. I would like to go to the community mental health team. Or you could say, I really feel like I'd like to be referred for a specialist centre, which there are two the GP can make the referral for, the Oxford Centre and CADAT if you're an adult, and the others would have to come from the community mental health team making the referral. But the point is, sometimes I think with GPs, it might be worth, if you know what it is you want and just saying, look, this is what I want, and then hopefully they'll be amenable to that.
Brilliant. So again, going in very clear about what you want and what you need, and being very clear about that.
Yeah, I think so.
So the next question that we got, and I suspect again that this is maybe something that you hear quite commonly, is somebody they understand that they need CBT and ERP, but they've actually been offered a different type of therapy. So they've specifically mentioned EMDR, but I guess it could be any type of therapy. What would you suggest somebody does in that circumstance? They don't actually say where they're being offered it, but I guess that's kind of not too relevant.
Who's that for?
either of you. Barbara, do you want to take it, and then Paul do add?
No, I'll start, and then Paul, please do.
Yeah.
I think the really, really important thing to always keep in mind with any therapy is the two proven effective treatments for OCD are CBT with ERP and medication. Now, we often hear of people being offered perhaps something in the meantime. So I've heard, for example, of people being offered some kind of a family therapy in the short term, or some kind of perhaps lower intensity talking therapy. And these things can be, they can be helpful and supportive. They will not make your OCD go away. And I think you have to be really, really clear about that. And sometimes we have to push a bit harder to say, actually, the recommended treatment in the NICE guidelines for treating OCD is CBT with ERP. Please, can you refer me? If for some reason or other that doesn't get you anywhere, then I think it is about escalating that and asking why in writing they are not complying with the NICE guidelines. What's the reason why they're offering you the EMDR treatment rather than that? And then you can use that as the basis for then taking that forward if necessary, into a complaint or an appeal. Hopefully you won't need to go that far, but that would give you the kind of starting point for that. But so often when we talk to people on the helpline and their treatment hasn't worked and they are very frustrated because maybe they've done years of treatment, it's often because the treatment hasn't included that good exposure and response prevention element of the CBT. It's heartbreaking because these people really want to get better. And I know with my own daughter, it took a long time for us to understand that, Paul. I wish I'd listened to my own presentation 30 years ago. It's only with the right treatment that she started to show the fabulous recovery that she has had.
That's such a powerful message. Paul, is there anything you would like to add or say further to that?
Yeah, I agree with everything Barbara said.
Yeah.
And the reason why CBT with ERP, I think, is so effective, or can be so effective, is because it tackles OCD from both sides. There's the cognitive side where someone will learn how to reframe the pattern their brain goes through. One of the things I found very interesting when I did CBT with ERP is that every single time I was having an OCD episode, it's exactly the same process. It didn't look the same to me. It always looked different, but it is the same. It's something we actually find on the helpline. A lot of people call up and they say, oh, I've got scrupulosity OCD. I need a therapist who really understands scrupulosity. And we explain to them, no, it's OCD is the same, no matter what the symptoms are, and the treatment is the same, the pattern is the same. And yeah, CBT with ERP has to be an integral part of the therapy if you're looking to go down the therapy route rather than just the medication. One of the things that might be worth asking, because you mentioned EMDR, is, well, why have they offered EMDR? If the community mental health team has come up with a treatment plan where they say, okay, well, this person has PTSD and their intrusive thoughts relate to the trauma they're having, then yes, then it would be quite customary that you would have both EMDR and CBT with ERP. But there isn't really a reason why you would not have the CBT with ERP. The one other caveat is if you have an eating disorder and your BMI is very low, then it's important that your BMI gets up to a sort of a relatively healthy rate so that you can go on and do CBT with ERP. One of the frustrations some people phone us and they have is that they're not being offered CBT with ERP because their weight's so low. That actually is that is the standard protocol. You have to be of a sort of healthy weight to get through the course because it can be quite demanding. And so if you have that situation, if your BMI is very low, you will probably have to deal with that first, and then you can move on to CBT with ERP.
Yeah, I think that's really helpful information, isn't it? And again, that might be something that people can come and discuss with the helpline if they're facing that. And also, I guess it kind of takes me a bit on to the next question, Paul, and perhaps it might be something you're happy to speak a bit to about dual diagnosis and whether that stops somebody from getting treatment for OCD, and how can they ensure that their treatment is taken into account. So this person isn't specifically saying what their dual diagnosis is, but they're saying, will the fact that they've got more than one condition stop them from getting treatment for their OCD, or should it stop them from getting treatment?
It definitely shouldn't. And it's, anyone that has OCD is entitled under the NICE guidelines to CBT with ERP. And that is the same no matter what your comorbidity is. It is actually quite common that people have OCD, also have comorbidities. It's important that the therapist you see is aware of if it's autism, ADHD, whatever it is, so they can incorporate that within the course. They need to be sensitive to it. But ultimately, it is still CBT with ARP. You are still given the same rights. One thing that could be seen as a slight divergence is, there is the step care model. If you feel that you have other comorbidities, if you feel that you are in a more severe case, you might decide that you would sooner go to the community mental health team as the first resort, or even possibly tertiary care, rather than an IAP service. But that's probably something to discuss with the doctor and the other healthcare professional.
That's really helpful. Barbara, is there anything you wanted to add to that?
No, I think Paul's covered it beautifully.
Brilliant, thank you. So Barbara, I think you did cover this next question in the presentation. I just wondered if there's anything you wanted to add. Does someone need a diagnosis in order to be offered treatment?
So no, they don't. It's all about the symptoms that you have and the impact that it's having on your life. And the assessment that is given should absolutely be sufficient for you to be able to then go on and receive the treatment. Just occasionally, there's some reason why a diagnosis is valuable. As I said, that has to be done by a psychiatrist. They're the only people who can actually diagnose OCD or any mental health condition. Sometimes it can be really useful to sit and have that conversation with somebody so senior, but you don't need it for treatment, and it should not hold you back from getting the treatment.
Really important key message. Thank you. And I think also this was covered in the presentation as well, but for either of you, perhaps Paul, you could speak to this. This person is asking, can they still get CBT and ERP treatment if they refuse medication?
Yes, absolutely. The thing about the treatment is it's for you. And you are in the driving seat. If you don't want to take medication, that's fine. And if you don't want to do therapy, that's also your choice. No one's ever going to force you. When I first considered treatment plans, I was worried I was going to be, handcuffed and taken away. It doesn't work that way. So you are in the driving seat. And if you do start the medication and then you decide, you know what, this isn't really for me, you can ask your doctor, how do I wean myself off it? They're not going to say, oh, actually, no, we've started, you have to continue. It doesn't work that way. And no, I mean, there are plenty of people who do CBT with ERP without ever doing medication. There is, however, evidence, I believe, that people who do CBT with ERP and the medication together, it can have a higher success rate to make the therapy work. But again, that doesn't mean, it's also got a high success rate if you don't have the medication. So it's entirely a personal choice.
Yeah, thank you.
I would just add a tiny bit to that, which is that the reason why I think it can be successful whenever you combine the two is that the anti-obsessional medication can make the CBT process, the ERP process, just a little bit easier to go through. As I mentioned in the presentation, it can be quite stressful tackling your OCD, confronting those fears that you've had. And if the medication just helps a little bit, take some of the edge off the obsession, it can give you a little bit of that kickstart through it. But absolutely, it's got to be your choice. It really is your body, your mind, your life, and no one should ever make you feel like you don't have that choice.
Yeah, can I just add a few things just on the medication? One is, if people are unaware, it can take sort of 3 weeks to get started and 3 months to get to full effect. So if you've been taking them for a couple of weeks, not a lot's happening. That's not necessarily a concern. They are known as antidepressants, these SSRIs. Obviously, in the case for someone who's taking them for OCD, it is not to treat depression. In your case, it is for OCD. We wouldn't want someone to feel like, okay, well, I'm not depressed. These aren't the right ones for me. And sometimes people augment the medication with antipsychotics. Again, I personally, I don't like that name because I think it has connotation. That can sometimes be a good treatment plan, and it doesn't mean what it maybe says it does. It's a different, it's just that is the name.
Yeah.
But I think sometimes just the labels of these medications can be a little bit off-putting for people. I wouldn't want people to feel that way. These are very good treatments that are registered to help make the thoughts feel less sticky and hopefully get your symptoms down.
Yeah, and I think that's so important, isn't it, about thinking about the impact that treatment and medication can have on somebody's life, rather than necessarily the labels that are used within the within perhaps the NHS. And actually, one of the questions that got asked was actually came from kind of thinking about the label that might come for this person if they go to their GP for treatment. And I suspect this might actually be a concern that sits with a lot of people. So this person was saying that if they're really concerned that if they go and get treatment, that then that will end up on their medical record as a label that they have OCD, and that might hinder their future life. So particularly they were saying about maybe getting a job in the future. I was wondering if that's a concern or a question that comes up for you both as helpline advisors often, and how you might respond to that. Does either of you particularly want to respond to that question?
I'm happy to start, Paul. And
yeah, go for it.
Yeah, yes, absolutely. And actually, I remember as a parent with my own daughter being absolutely terrified. You know, there you have a really bright 13-year-old, and you're absolutely terrified that you're going to give her this massive label if we go and see somebody about her mental health. That you really do worry about it. I think it's an understandable concern to have. I guess the way I would look at it now is that what happens if you don't do something about it? So if you kind of turn the thing around and say, look, if you go and get professional treatment and the right treatment, then the OCD or the BDD or the repetitive behaviors that they have, they'll get tackled, they'll get sorted, and you, they, your child, daughter, whoever it is, can get on with having a brilliant life. And without that treatment, probably things aren't going to improve, and things may indeed get worse rather than better. So I think it's really about trying to focus on the positive side of it and not worry too much about those labels. And also recognizing that there's a lot of quite strict data privacy that sits around, guidelines that sit around our medical records and the things that we have that are confidential. At work, for example, you do not have to disclose that you have OCD. Even if your OCD is classed as a disability, it's up to you whether you disclose that or not. So again, it's kind of in your, largely in your power, what you do and don't disclose. And so I would always say, yeah, absolutely, don't worry too much about those things and just focus on helping somebody get better. Paul, I don't know whether you'd add anything to that from your perspective.
Yeah, I think it's important to say that medical records are private and they're protected. You know, when you go to the NHS, you don't actually need to tell that many people about your intrusive thoughts or your compulsions. The GP never needs to know. They just need to make the referral. The only person that really needs to know in some sort of depth about your OCD is your CBT therapist. And even then, if you're not comfortable talking about all the intrusive thoughts or even most of them, they can probably still hopefully be able to treat you, although it's easier for them if they have all the information. So there is a sense, if you want to keep it secret from your friends, your family, your work, everyone, that is your gift. You are allowed to do that. It's your condition, it's your treatment. There are, however, advantages, as you mentioned, of telling, for instance, your employer, because then you're protected under the Equality Act 2010. It's a registered disability, and you get reasonable adjustments at work. So if you need time off for therapy, if you're at university and you need more time in exams, that sort of thing, you can apply because you've registered with them that you have this condition. But even then, you don't have to tell everyone at work. You can tell your direct employer and say, look, I do want this to be kept secret, or private maybe is a better word. You know, and I would like the reasonable adjustments. The other thing to say is, in terms of those reasonable adjustments, you don't have to say to your employer, oh, by the way, I have to shower 5 hours a night. You can just say, I have a diagnosis of a mental health condition, or I have a diagnosis of OCD. It is protected. Here are the reasonable adjustments I would require. And then they have a statutory responsibility to provide those if they're seen as reasonable.
It's some really important information there, and just thinking about what both of you are saying, actually, I think really thinking very carefully about who you feel comfortable with sharing the information with about your OCD, how you share it in terms of the information that you do share, and then really thinking about the potential benefits of disclosing when you do, and how that might positively impact your life, as well as the potential risks.
Probably worth mentioning that actually, if you are discriminated against at work, for instance, because you have OCD, then that means that your employer is in breach of the Equality Act, which is a very serious thing. So it's not, you know, by law you are protected. It's not. If they are being discriminatory, that is actually something they shouldn't be doing, and it is, you know, there are legal recourse for them.
Yeah, I think that's really important. And again, there is, I think Barbara mentioned an organisation in the slide, Disability Rights UK, that provide a lot of information on that, and certainly the helpline would be able to provide initial information about that, but we could certainly signpost you on to people that could provide information. So our next question, I'm just keeping an eye on the time. I think we've got time for a couple more questions. I think this is quite an important question, but quite a difficult one to think through. The person that's asked this says that OCD makes it impossible for them to leave their house, and they're wondering if we have any thoughts on ways they could still access treatment. Perhaps Barbara, you might be happy to start with answering that.
So it's not uncommon for people with OCD to be in that position and to find it very, very difficult to go outside their own home for one reason or another. It can be extremely stressful to do so. So there are options that you have. The main thing to bear in mind is really back to what Paul's just been describing about your right. So a reasonable adjustment in that situation, and the Disability Act includes access to healthcare, so it's covered by that. So a reasonable adjustment would be to ask for a conversation that happened over the phone. And the local community mental health team and local mental health services should be in a position to provide you with the treatment that is relevant to you in the situation that you're in. And that may mean that somebody has an outreach program, so somebody comes to them, or it may mean that it's done over, for example, Zoom, something like this, where they use technology to help offer the treatment. If you find your local mental health services are not able to provide that, then you could use patient choice in a sense of finding a local authority or a nearby team that would be able to offer that. You could also think about patient choice and applying through patient choice to either CADAT or the Oxford hospitals. I know both those institutions, both those clinics, have very good, what they would call outreach services, and can arrange for different kinds of, they're used to treating people right across the country. They are national centres. And if you're living in the middle of England, you can't always get down to London for an appointment. So they are set up for doing that. So don't be put off by it. There's certainly ways around it. If you get stuck, come and have a chat on the helpline and we'll see if we can help you find it. But you have a right to a reasonable adjustment to access healthcare.
Yeah, I think the key thing there is the right to the reasonable adjustment, isn't it? And to really fight for that. Sorry, Paul. Yeah, do add. Yeah.
Just to add on that, you know, if your community mental health team says, look, we cannot do online therapy for whatever reason, they then have an obligation to find you a centre that can, or an alternative provider. It's not, they're not allowed to say, well, we can't do it, so good luck, you're on your own. You know, they have to actually make sure that you have a pathway to get treatment.
That's a great point. And I've spoken to people on the helpline that are using online therapies or outreach therapies from both CADAT and Oxford. And, you know, they work for you. They can work for you. So don't be put off accessing the treatment because of that.
Brilliant. Thank you. I think we have time for at least one more question. So this is a process-based question, and the process is particularly, is there a different process? And I think, Barbara, you covered this quite a lot in the presentation. Is the process different to access children and young people's services from adult services? Would there be a different process if it was a child accessing treatment from if it was an adult accessing treatment?
So fundamentally, I guess, no, in the sense that, you know, you go to your GP or the child goes to the GP with you. If they're under 16 or under, they would come with you, and the referral would be made in the case of a young person to CAMHS, and in the case of an adult, it would be made to the adult mental health services. I guess where the differences might creep in would be using patient choice is slightly different. So patient choice is open for young people at Oxford, not at CADAT itself, not that particular route. But other than that, I think it's pretty straightforward. It's going to a GP and moving yourself on. IAPT isn't open to those under 18. That's only 18 and over, so you can't make a self-referral. But fundamentally the same. Unless I've missed anything, Paul. Have I missed anything?
Not really. I mean, I suppose it's worth noting that if your child wants to go to a tertiary a national specialist centre, there is a dedicated one, the Michael Rutter Centre. The Oxford Centre also treats children. The other ones don't treat children. If your child is under 16, it's unlikely they'll be offered medication as a first port of call unless it's particular circumstances. So in general, therapy is the registered treatment first, and then maybe possibly later down the line considering medication. I should probably just advertise, we do actually have a youth helpline for people who are aged, not treatment, but we have a youth helpline for people aged 14 to 25, which is youthhelpline@ocdaction.org.uk. So people of that age can write in, they'll get a response from someone who has an experience of OCD of a similar age bracket. We also have a fortnightly online support group for people aged 16 to 20. So you can find that on the website as well. I think that's everything. Yeah.
Brilliant. Thank you. I really want to echo Paul's comment at the start of the Q&A session, but to both Paul and Barbara, I feel like the wealth of information that they have shared with us this evening has been phenomenal, and I just feel like we all will have taken something really important away this evening and really will help each of us as we move forward over the coming months. So a huge thank you to you both. If anybody would like any more information or you're left with any questions at all, I'm sure Paul and Barbara would agree, you'd be so welcome to call or email the helpline, or as Paul was just saying, if you're under 25, you're really welcome to email our youth helpline. And I'm sure just as we're coming to a close, we can share the slide that's got those contact details on and pop them in the Q&A as well. We will be having another webinar next month, so do keep an eye out for that. And I hope everybody has a lovely evening. Thank you very much to all of you for joining us, and hope to see you all again soon. Take care.
Thank you.